Okay, hey guys, welcome back to this week's weekly current events and election 2020 update. I'm Fatma Raja,
I'm Brandon Wu.
and so like always, this week we'll be taking you through some of the biggest things that have happened in terms of what's happening in the news. Then we're going to talk a little bit about impeachment, and then we're going to talk more about what's happening in the world of elections. But before we do any of that, make sure you guys all follow Fiveable across all of their social media apps. It's at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And there's always cool updates of new things Fiveable's doing and when all the streams are going to be. So it's a good resource to have to stay up to date with everything that's happening in terms of AP prep. And here is a calendar of all of the streams that are going to be happening this week. So Monday, there's going to be some AP Lang and math streams. Tuesday is stuff that's like AP Gov, the social sciences. Wednesday is science. And Thursday is going to be all the histories and AP World and stuff like that. So you guys can either take a picture of this or keep it in mind because that's what's going to be happening for the rest of this week. And so AP Gov is going to be doing Monday's current event streams. Like always, it'll be me, Brandon, and Akilish, and we'll be on a rotating schedule. And AP Gov always streams on Tuesdays with the rest of the social sciences, and AP Lang always streams Mondays. And so Brandon was literally doing a stream right before this because he's on the AP Lang team. So keep that in mind. But we're just going to talk a little bit about impeachment and tie in some AP Gov before talking about the State of the Union and a bunch of other stuff. So Brandon's going to take it away.
All right. So I guess we'll get started with impeachment. So this will actually be our last time talking about impeachment, unless, more articles of impeachment are created and passed, and then maybe we'll have another impeachment update. But we finally reached the final stage, what's kind of covered by our profile pictures in the bottom left. On the 5th of February, so 5 days ago, the Senate concluded the impeachment trial with a vote to acquit or to convict, or to remove, technically. So either to remove the president or not remove the president. And it was pretty much predicted by almost all analysts that he would get acquitted. In fact, on February 5th, he was, no surprise here, acquitted by a vote of 48-52 on the first article of abuse of power and 47-53 on the second article of obstruction of Congress. So we actually saw that one senator that was a Republican voted against President Trump and voted to convict and remove him. That was Mitt Romney of Utah. And it was it's a really interesting speech. I highly encourage you to watch it. It's 5 minutes on YouTube. He's on the verge of tears talking about how his allegiance to the oath of office and to God means that he has to declare President Trump guilty because the evidence said so. We also saw that it actually marked precedent that both the 2008 and 2012 Republican nominee for president voted against the 2016 nominee, President Trump. John McCain, the 2008 nominee, was the crucial swing vote to failing the Trump Care bill, or the American Health Care Act, which would have repealed and replaced Obamacare. And Mitt Romney voted to convict President Trump in the impeachment trial. Also, no Democrats voted for acquittal, which was pretty shocking because there are Democrats in a lot of swing red states, including West Virginia, Joe Manchin, and Doug Jones of Alabama, and both of them actually voted to convict, which shows that acquittal was actually partisan because only Republicans voted to make the president not guilty, whereas conviction was technically bipartisan. All right, so then I guess we'll move into the aftermath. So we actually saw that a few key witnesses, including Lieutenant Colonel Vindman of the National Security Council, his brother Yevgeny, and Ambassador Gordon Sondland to the EU, were actually fired this Friday. So after they testified in Congress, President Trump basically let them go. Technically, Colonel Vindman and his brother got reassigned to the Army and some other part, but Sondland did get let go. And it was sort of reflective of President Trump's argument that you have to have total loyalty to him, that you can't, go against his will or you'll suffer the consequences. In fact, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who voted for witnesses, which was like a vote that like pretty much everyone thought was going to decide whether or not President Trump might get convicted, that failed. Susan Collins is like a moderate from Maine, which is like a swingish state. It's partially blue, partially red. She actually said that the president learned his lesson from her vote for acquittal. And she also said that she opposed any kind of retribution against those who provided evidence against him. Yet we saw that these people got fired and no statement from her. We saw that the press secretary, Stephanie Grissom, actually called the acquittal a total exoneration and vindication. So the White House's messages, we got acquitted, we did nothing wrong, this was a partisan impeachment by the Democrats. And yeah, that's sort of the narrative that's going into 2020. So I think like overall, a lot of people said that like impeachment and conviction of the president or acquittal of the president would benefit one party or the other. I don't know if that's true to a significant extent. For instance, if we look at this AP Gov tie-in, you can see that Americans are divided on whether President Trump should have been acquitted, because 33% surveyed agreed with his acquittal and 44% disagreed. So we actually have like 23% who are undecided. And it shows that public polling is really important because it shows like, public opinion as a source of like influence, especially when we're talking about the reliability of data and whether like of those 33%, were a large majority Republican? Probably so. So we can kind of see that impeachment probably didn't benefit one party or the other. I'd say they're pretty much even at this point in time, because not only are Democrats more fired up to replace President Trump, Republicans are fired up because the president almost got impeached. All right. So then we'll move into some other domestic events, including the State of the Union. So as you can see in that top left picture up there, basically, President Trump preached this message of the economy. He said that African-American, Hispanic, and Asian American unemployment was at the lowest it's been in years. He argued that there was a blue-collar boom, that he would protect Medicare, Social Security, and people with pre-existing conditions. He brought in the leader of Venezuela, or the leader of the opposition, Juan Guaido, and sort of used it as a reason to emphasize why socialism was bad, saying that Democrats on the left who are running against him, like Bernie Sanders, were advocating for a socialist takeover of our healthcare system. And he was like, hey, this guy from Venezuela is the reason why we don't want socialism. It's an interesting tactic. He also said that he wanted to protect people with Medicare, Social Security, and people with pre-existing conditions, which is actually a pretty notable thing that Obamacare does. It's very popular among Republicans and Democrats, because before President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, in the past, if you had a pre-existing condition such as asthma, diabetes, some kind of condition, you could actually see that your premiums would go up because insurance companies would say, oh, you have a condition, you have to pay more for insurance. And that is no longer true under the ACA. But I don't know, we've seen some mixed messages on that, given that President Trump's administration is actually, or many Republicans are signed on to a lawsuit that President Trump supports that repeals Obamacare and repeals the provision that protects people with pre-existing conditions. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer them. Fatima, I'm sure, would have a great answer too, because we're here to talk about current events, not just like us going on monologues about what's happening in our news. So yeah, I'd love for this to be like a two-way conversation. Anyways, some other news. The state of New York, like the people, because they passed a green light law, which basically said that undocumented immigrants can get driver's licenses, and they barred immigration officials from getting access to DMV information. So they cut off contact with the federal government. The United States federal government decided, hey, we're not going to let you use global entry anymore, which is this like system where if you pay like $100 a year, you can go to the airport and you don't have to wait through like the immigration counters because you already had like an interview. You're like cleared straight through customs and stuff. So this actually touches on a key AP Gov concept, federalism, how our federal and state governments interact. And it shows how like, because of the supremacy clause, technically there's this interaction where state governments should be, giving their authority to immigration officials, which are technically above this. I guess it's sort of like a conflict over whether states should have sovereignty or whether the federal government is supreme. So it's kind of like a modern day conflict between the federal and state government. Kind of crazy. Also, Qasem al-Rimi, the leader of the AQAP or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was killed in an airstrike in Yemen. It wasn't covered as much because of the State of the Union, because of the disastrous Iowa caucuses, which Felon will be talking about in just a second. And yeah, it's insane. There's actually a $10 million reward offered for al-Rimi, which he was killed in an airstrike, which also shows that the United States, even though President Trump promised that we would get out of endless wars, we're still supporting our allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, in that Yemeni civil war. And as a result, we killed a terrorist leader. All right. So in terms of international events, there weren't a lot of crazy updates. But the first one was that death toll from coronavirus has actually reached at least 910 with over 40,000 people infected. The global death toll actually has surpassed the toll from the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s, which has shown that the Chinese government, where coronavirus originated, didn't necessarily do the best of jobs containing. We've also seen that a bunch of countries have now ended flights. In fact, 2/3 of international flights from and to China have been canceled because of the lack of passenger demand because of the virus, and also generally because of health and safety risks and concerns. Although the World Health Organization did say in a press release that they advised member countries not to put in place travel bans against China, because when you put in travel bans, it actually cuts off like global interconnectivity, interdependence, and like connectivity between the countries. So, but yeah, we're still seeing countries like the United States, Russia, Turkey, some of the EU countries, they ignored the World Health Organization, as people do. And yeah, China's kind of closed off right now. Also in El Salvador, this happened like literally in the last few hours. Armed soldiers, police officers, and El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, stormed parliament and basically said that opposition lawmakers needed to vote to approve his plan to give $109 million to equip military personnel and law enforcement officials to tackle gang violence. But the issue is a lot of people are saying, oh, this might be like authoritarian, and the opposition lawmakers in El Salvador, as you can see in that bottom right picture, are afraid that the president could use that money for bad, which like El Salvador has the highest murder rate in all of Central America, which means that they're like afraid the money might go not to the right places. There's worries of corruption, things like that. And yeah, those are the international events that really happened within the last week since Akalesh captured this stuff. So now I'll hand it over to Fatima for the 2020 election update.
Okay, so I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions on their mind about what happened in Iowa, because I remember like when we were like in our AP Gov Fiveable group chat, everyone was like, oh, we're gonna stay up late and wait for the results. And then that didn't end up happening because a lot of chaos ensued. And so if you're confused about what happened in Iowa, don't worry, because most of us were for a hot second there. And so what ended up happening was that the chosen reporting methods for around like 1,700 precincts failed. And so that's what caused all of that chaos. And it's also the reason why like it's kind of like we didn't get results until yesterday, whereas like in the past, we would have gotten results from the Iowa caucuses like way faster. And so the Iowa Democratic Party, pretty much like what ended up happening was that they wanted to streamline the process of caucuses reporting numbers, right? And so they thought a great way to do that is technology. And so they decided to use this app by a company called Shadow, which, by the way, sketchiest company name ever, to like get those numbers in, right? So pretty much like the precinct captains and like people who were like at the caucuses in charge of like reporting those numbers would like report them through the apps. And so they also decided 3 rounds of numbers were going to be reported. The like vote tallies from the first round where people chose who they wanted to be the nominee, the second round, and then like the final like delegate count. And so what the issue became the app glitched and phone lines started backing up. And so people were also not trained to use it because the app wasn't ready in time to like implement that training. So there wasn't like a lot of like testing or training for the people who had to like end up using the app to like figure out how to like troubleshoot or figure out what glitch was happening or how to fix a glitch that happened. And so that caused a lot of like confusion. And so a lot of people that were in charge of reporting the numbers decided to just like call in and report like what numbers they had by calling like the Central Iowa Democratic Party, right? And so the issue with that was that the phone lines got backed up. And so people couldn't get in through the phones and they also couldn't report through like the app. And so there was a bunch of confusion. And so there were also like rule changes that ended up happening on how like people were going to choose the candidate they were supporting. And so all of these like different factors led to a lot of like chaos, and people didn't really know what the final like vote count was because nobody was, or not nobody, but like a lot of like caucuses weren't able to like actually report what their final like vote counts were. And so nobody really knew what was going on. And so you're probably wondering, after all of that, who really won the Iowa caucuses, right? So the breakdown is that Pete Buttigieg, who's the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, should be getting 14 delegates. Vermont Senator Sanders should be getting 12, Elizabeth Warren 8, Joe Biden 6, and Amy Klobuchar 1. And so even now, it isn't completely resolved because Bernie Sanders' campaign asked the Iowa Democratic Party, which I abbreviated as IDP because there's no point of saying that repetitively. Anyways, they asked for a partial recanvass of 25 precincts. And so a partial recanvass or a recanvass, it pretty just means to like second check the vote. It's just like fancy terminology. And so his campaign said that they were asking for this recount or like second check of the vote was that if the errors were corrected, Sanders would get another national delegate, right? And so that would obviously like help potentially close the gap between him and Pete Buttigieg. And so it would just, in the end of like the entire primary season, matter a lot potentially, or maybe not. But he also said that he won he also earned the most votes on the initial vote at the caucuses in both the first round of voting and the second round. And so in the first round of voting, if you weren't here on one of the past streams, everyone just chooses who like they want the candidate to be, right? But on the second round, if your candidate isn't deemed to be viable, which means they don't have 15% of like the vote of the people at the caucus, you can choose a different candidate, or you can try to get more people to support your candidate. So in both rounds of that voting, Bernie Sanders won the popular vote. And so he's asking for a recanvass to like figure out if there were any discrepancies or any errors, and try to correct them pretty much. And so another thing that happened is that the Democratic National Committee chairman, Tom Perez, he also asked the party officials in Iowa to recanvass like the entire like state, which they are not going to be doing. But this is why I asked the question, should Iowa be the first state in the Democratic primary? Because there's also like, this has been a interesting conversation that's been happening in the Democratic Party for a while. Partly because of situations like this, but also because of the fact that Iowa, it's not very representative of like voters in the Democratic Party as a whole. It's by a very large majority white. And so a lot of people in the Democratic Party are people of color, right? And so like Black people, Hispanic people, like even Asian people, right? And so like a lot of those people aren't very well represented when it comes to the Iowa caucuses because they're just not, like they're in Iowa, but not very large amounts of those like groups are represented. So interesting conversation to be having there. But yeah, that's what happened in Iowa. And so another interesting thing is that coming out of Iowa, usually the person or the candidate that like gets the most amount of delegates is seen to be like the front runner, right? But we didn't see that like huge boost this time because of all of that confusion, right? So like if everything had gone perfectly and Pete Buttigieg had gotten all of these delegates, then we probably would have seen like way more conversation about how he's this like huge front runner. And we like have seen it happening, but not to the same extent that it would have if like all of this chaos hadn't ensued. So also, let's talk a little bit about Senate races. So Brandon talked a little bit about how no Democrat in the Senate voted to acquit Donald Trump. And so one of the reasons why that's really interesting is because a lot of these Democrats are coming out of like really red states. And so senators like Kyrsten Sinema, who is from Arizona, she is one of those senators. Arizona typically has been like a pretty red state. And so let's talk a little bit about a Senate race that's going to be happening there this year. So there's two main people in this Arizona Senate race. The first is Mark Kelly. He is running as a Democrat. He is a former NASA astronaut, and if you've heard of like NASA's twin study, he was a part of that. He stayed on Earth while his brother went to live on the International Space Station, so NASA could like see the effects of like living in space as compared to like Earth and the impacts that would have. He also served in the Navy, and he's married to former Representative Gabrielle Giffords. And so she served in the House of Representatives until she decided to retire after getting shot. And so now she's a big advocate for gun control. And the other is Senator Martha McSally. She is she's one of the current Arizona senators, in addition to Kyrsten Sinema. And she served in the Air Force, and she was the first female pilot to fly in combat, and she retired as a colonel. And so the interesting thing about her is that she became the senator after losing her Senate race in 2018 to Kyrsten Sinema. But what ended up happening was after John McCain's death, Governor Doug Ducey appointed her to the other Senate seat. And so that's how she pretty much got her seat. And so right now, Mark Kelly has had 2 times the individual Arizona-based donors in the final quarter of 2019 as Martha McSally. And so he's been outraising her overall and for the past 3 quarters. And the reason why that's interesting is that if like, particularly as we saw in like the Senate's not overwhelming, but like its partisan acquittal of Donald Trump. The reason why that happened is because there's like more Republicans in the Senate, right? And so there's a lot of important things that the Senate does, like tie into AP Gov here. It confirms nominees. It like does the trial for impeachment. So if Democrats potentially want to like have the Senate, it's states like Arizona that have had the potential to swing blue, that is going to happen, and where they're going to like have the most ground to gain. So the fact that he's been outraising her, and specifically and people who are actually living in Arizona, is pretty interesting and significant there. But like we also will be talking about now, Republicans obviously want to keep their hold on like Congress and the executive branch, right? So Trump recently released his budget proposal. And like Brandon just said, even though he said he would be protecting people who like had health issues and people who are like had Medicare, Medicaid, that's not what's happening in his budget. His proposal is cutting $465 billion from Medicare providers like hospitals, and over the next decade, it's cutting $700 billion from Medicaid. And so there's also a bunch of other cuts that are like eliminating heating subsidies for the poor and millions of dollars worth of grants that like boost community service work by senior citizens, right? And so it's also like targeting student loans and Environmental Protection Agency funds. And so this budget is stands in pretty sharp contrast as compared to like what President Trump was saying that he would be doing in his State of the Union speech, right? And so it not only shows that like sometimes people will say one thing but do another, but it also will be a way for Democrats to talk about the fact that President Trump is targeting people who have pre-existing conditions and who like need healthcare the most, right? Like people who cannot afford it, and the elderly, right? In terms of Medicaid and Medicare. And so in terms of the 2020 election, that's like a big thing that Democrats will be able to talk about. But the thing is, it's not going to pass in the House of Representatives because there's like a Democratic majority and they're not going to be voting for cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. And also because even like Republicans in the House and the Senate, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are like historically unpopular among voters because it's like healthcare for the elderly and like people who don't have the money to afford healthcare otherwise. And so it's really not going to pass in terms of like these huge cuts. Yeah. And the last thing we're going to be talking about is like a little bit of nitty gritty. It's going to be talking about Florida's constitutional amendment. And so this is going to be a little bit of a throwback to 2018, but in 2018, Florida passed this constitutional amendment to their state constitution, not to the national constitution, because you can't like do that on the state level all by yourself. That restored voting rights to people who had felony convictions. And so this was people, it's like almost like 1.5 million people, right? And so that is a huge number. But the issue that like arose was that there's this Florida law that requires ex-felons to pay all of the fines and fees that they owe before they can vote, right? So even after they're released from prison, they still have to pay those fees. And so the Florida Supreme Court said that felons would have to pay them before they can vote. So that's like a huge barrier to actually being able to exercise your right to vote, right? Because especially if you're like coming out of jail or prison, there's a lot of barriers in terms of like having to like check the box of whether or not you were ever like convicted of a crime. And so that can prevent you from getting a job. And so groups that like protect civil liberties like the ACLU are suing in federal court to stop that from happening because they're essentially comparing it to like a poll tax. And so if you remember from APUSH or even from AP Gov, a poll tax is pretty much like you have to pay. And so that's exactly what Micah Kubik, the executive director from the ACLU of Florida, said that it pretty much comes down to like saying that people have to pay to vote, and that's plain wrong, according to him. But the reason why this is especially important is because it not only affects the 2020 election because Florida is a swing state, but also it's a larger conversation about how we decide whether or not people, once they've served out their like prison term and like what society has deemed like a fair punishment for their actions, how easy it is to be like reintegrated into society, and how whether or not they're going to remain disenfranchised until they like pay to be able to vote again, right? And so this is like probably going to be resolved at some point, but it's going to have a pretty big impact on the 2020 election because we're talking about like 1.4 million people here that like are having their voting rights restored almost. They're going to have them restored after they pay all those fees and fines, right? So that's like a pretty big caveat, especially when you don't have a big social safety net. And so ending on that note, here is the weekly stream calendar. This is pretty much all of these streams are going to be, or not pretty much, all of these streams are going to be free when they're live, and then replays will be with your Fiveable membership. And so make sure you follow all of our AP Gov teams and our AP Lang team. Each Monday, AP Lang will be streaming at 7 p.m. Brandon was streaming before this, and then AP Gov streams each Tuesday. And each Monday, we also have our weekly current events and election update with me and Brandon and Akilish rotating in between weeks. And so if you aren't already doing so, make sure you also follow Fiveable. And if you have any questions, me and Brandon are totally down to answer them. And so drop them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them. But okay, so seeing none, bye. Hope we see you guys next week. Thank you so much
Adios.
for tuning in.